Welcome to Stop Overthinking, the podcast for overthinkers, people pleasers, and perfectionists who want to feel calm and confident enough to handle whatever life sends your way. I'm your host, Kristen Odegaard, a women's life and mindset coach, lifelong educator, and recovering perfectionist. Welcome back to another episode of the Stop Overthinking podcast. Today we have a guest with us, Leah Horton. Leah is a certified intuitive eating counselor and a master health and life coach specializing in helping women get off diet roller coaster for good. She uses principles of intuitive eating. She empowers women to find their food freedom, love their bodies, and redefine what health means to them. Welcome to the podcast, Leah.
Hi, Kristen. Thank you so much for having me.
So you are an intuitive eating counselor and a master coach. What brought you to this field? And tell us a little bit more about yourself.
I am very much like most women, especially in America, where I have struggled with body image and dieting for a large part of my life, like pretty much late teens, all of my 20s, and struggled with my weight and emotional eating and just like beating myself up. I was classic, like over exerciser, under eater. I am a type A personality. And so I was like obsessive about like MyFitnessPal and like calorie counting everything and like trying to make my body basically a math equation, right? Like if I eat this and I move this much, then this is what should be happening on the scale. And the math never mathed. Like it did not work out. You know, I would lose maybe a little bit and then I would end up gaining it back. I would get injured from over exercising. And all of this kind of stemmed, I mean, I think it's always a number of things, but the main trigger for me was actually a doctor's appointment where my doctor I was perfectly healthy and he was like, oh, well, you are overweight on the BMI chart. So you should probably lose, 15, 20 pounds to get back into the normal range. And again, I was perfectly healthy. Like by all accounts, my blood count was good. I was active. I, had a balanced diet, but it sent me into a spiral of making myself feel bad and shameful and wrong for being technically overweight. Like I said, over a decade of battling this, and it like created so much anxiety and it ended up having a lot of negative impacts on my health. And like here I thought I was like doing the thing that my doctor told me to do to get to be healthy and normal. And yet it ended up having a lot of negative consequences, both physically and mentally. I went down anxiety rabbit hole and dealt with some depression and made my body image even worse, right?
Mm-hmm.
And dealing with chronic injury, I had a lot of digestive issues. I ended up getting diagnosed with fibromyalgia, which they think is triggered from all the stress of like the dieting. And I stumbled into it. Like it wasn't even a conscious thing. I didn't even really realize it was a problem, but I stumbled into the concept of health at every size. And I'm a giant nerd. I got my undergrad in biology, and this book was packed with scientific evidence that validated my experience of like, it's not me. I'm not the problem. My weight isn't necessarily a problem. And it completely turned my world upside down. Like I had to redefine what health really meant if we weren't using the number on the scale, and had to change. I changed my behaviors to like try and get out of like that dieter and weight focused mindset. Like what is healthy eating even, right? If we're like told all of these messages. And the Health at Every Size book led me to intuitive eating, and like I was done. Like I was like, this is completely changing my life. And so I ended up kind of making it my mission to help other women find the path for themselves, because I know how exhausting it was to be so wrapped up in how my body looked and the number on the scale and how much grief it caused me unnecessarily and had the opposite intended effect, right? Like it was just not a great way to be living my life. And so, now I get to help other women free themselves from the number on the scale.
Fantastic. So thank you so much for sharing all of that. And there was so much in there that definitely resonated with me from the obsessiveness of my fitness pal and weighing and measuring food and doing those. But I think most of our listeners can identify with wanting the formula, right? And it seems like if I have this many calories and I burn this much or whatever, like this is what's supposed to happen on the scale. And this number on the scale should equate to this look of a body. And in my experience, the average woman, that's really difficult to do. I mean, it's one thing if you are doing a bikini competition and want to dedicate your life for a period of time to your physique, right? But the average woman, that is just such a struggle. So you had mentioned as well that you're kind of a type A sort of person. And why do you think that people with perfectionistic tendencies, the type A, that disordered eating is frequently a problem for them?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there's also like a really strong connection between like perfectionism and people pleasing, right? And so like for me, this trigger of like my doctor telling me like, oh, you need to lose weight. This doctor is a professional and I look at them as like an authority figure. They know what they're talking about. If he's telling me that I need to lose 20 pounds, then gosh darn it, I need to go lose 20 pounds. And so then it becomes this like, well, when I go back and see him in a year, like I want to be able to say like, look at me, I did what you asked. And so we tend to like, it's also coupled with like, I think the higher anxiety, right? We want to get the accolade. We want to get the acknowledgement. We don't want to disappoint anybody, right? And there's so many layers to this, right? It's also culturally, we want to fit in and look the part. And if we have the impression that we're too large or too soft or too any sort of way, that creates this feeling of like unsafety, right? And we need to, we want to desperately like fit in and be accepted and acknowledged. And because our society puts such a strong emphasis on the thin ideal and having a very narrow scope of what our beauty standards are, it just puts this pressure on ourselves. We get most of our messaging from media, and the typical woman, I do think it's changing a little bit, but like in the era that I grew up in, the typical image that you're seeing is of women that are thin, they're lean, they're maybe tall, they have long flowy hair, they don't have any blemishes, thank you Photoshop and whatever else, doctoring they're doing. You don't see any flaws at all. And because most of the messages that we're getting is from technology, movies, TV, magazines, it creates this idea in our head that like that's what's normal. And the reality is that only 5 to 8% of the population can naturally achieve that kind of body type. And even then they still have imperfections that have been, edited out. So we've set this bar for ourselves that is so insanely high and unattainable for everybody. We're just setting ourselves up to fail all the time if that's the benchmark that we're using. And it's not, our fault. I'm definitely not blaming anybody. We're a product of the society that we live in. But that society values a certain beauty standard
it does.
more than anything else.
And I think, like you said, it may slowly be changing with some of the other generations, but the mindset, that I'm dealing with, that you're dealing with, and a lot of other women that are in their, 30s plus, is still very much the cultural and societal sort of issues, that we talked about. You kind of alluded to it, but what is fat phobia? And talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So, like anything, fat phobia kind of exists on a spectrum, and our society is just fat phobic. Basically, meaning we fear ourselves or other people being of size. And really, fat is just a an adjective to describe somebody like tall or short. It's you can be fat or you can be thin, but we have connected morality to body size. And we have associated, like, there's a stereotype of if somebody is in a large body, it is their fault. 100%. Like, it's something that is within their control. It shows that they don't have discipline, they don't have willpower, that they aren't prioritizing like themselves. And there's a lot to it that we make it wrong. Now, this is not my area of expertise, but there is a lot of research connecting like fat phobia to racism and sexism, and it intersects a lot of other areas. But really at the root of it is we just have something against people of a larger size. And what we don't really know, unless you've like actually gone down the rabbit hole, is that your body size is not as much in your control as we've been led to believe. Like, you can't decide your shoe size, right? You can't decide, how long your arms are. There are a significant number of genes at play when it comes to your body size as well. But because we live in a world full of diet culture that has multi-billion dollars of influence over us, they make it seem like, well, if you just eat less and move more, then you should be in a normal body size.
Right.
But body diversity exists. People of all sizes have always existed. And it isn't a moral failing to be in a larger body, right? And there's connections to like trauma. Like, if you have taken like the ACE, adverse child conditions thing, if you have more of those, you're more likely to be in a larger body. And like, but then we're gonna like blame the individual for that. Like, that's
right.
It's so backwards.
It is. So again, so much, resonates there with me. As someone who has struggled with my body image and weight issues for decades, what does deprogramming look like to be able to get into intuitive eating? Because we talked about having some of these perfectionist tendencies, and I think there's a real fear of letting go and adapting something else. And so I'll just let you talk, because otherwise
yeah. Well, I mean, and the first thing is just like first having the awareness, right? That this pressure and thoughts that you have about your body are not your own, right? They are thoughts that have been programmed into you by society at large, by parents, by kids bullying you when you were a kid, like whatever. You have gotten all of these messages that being in a larger body, and when I say larger body, I don't even necessarily mean like plus size or anything like that. It's like I'm in a mid-size, what we call a mid-size body. Like, I'm pretty solidly like a size US 14. And in my brain, that's like way too big, right? Like, it's like, if you're in double digits, that's bad news, right? Don't you dare get out of the 100s on the scale, right? But in my disordered brain, because I've gotten all this messaging, it's like this body dysmorphia kicks in of like, oh my God, I'm so fat, is what I used to like tell myself. So you have to have some level of awareness of like your thoughts and what's happening. And I think actively like asking yourself, like, is this helpful to me? Like, is this actually healthy for me? Like, when I can look at it, like, it is not healthy for me to sustain a quote unquote normal weight, right? Like, my history has shown that it is mentally, emotionally, physically unhealthy for me to do that. So what's really the problem here? Is it health or is it vanity, right? Because if it's truly health, then losing weight's not the answer for me. And you can be healthy at any size. Now, not everybody is healthy at every size, but you can be, right? And if it's vanity, like, be real with yourself about that. Okay, why am I putting so much importance into how I look? And just start to question everything. Now, I do find with people that are like type A analytical like me, they tend to really do well with getting into the research like I did and like seeing the evidence of like, oh, weight doesn't equal health. And oh, the average woman in America is a size 16, 18. Oh, like look at history, like look at body sizes over history, look at the roots of fat phobia and all of that. Like do the research and collect the data and give airtime to that. Right now, the main messages we get is promoted by diet culture and the thin ideal.
Yes.
So even if you're not changing your mind yet, at least get the other side of the story. Right? And then make an informed decision from there on what it is that where do you want to put your money, put your money where your mouth is, like, which values do you want to uphold? And like, I know for me, one of the things that was very, very clear is I don't judge other people for their body size. The people I love has nothing to do with their body size. My value is in the kind of person I am, my humanity, my empathy, my affection and love, and my willingness to like help other people. Like that's the stuff that makes me me, and that is important. It has nothing to do with the fact that I have a size 14 pair of pants, right?
Yeah. Well, and then we can get into, sizing, because
that's a whole thing.
literally make up their own sizing. So yes, again, yes. So much there. And the deprogramming process, I think, is, so much is subconscious because it's just there. It's what we've been fed. And I know when I was doing my original coach certification, and I have a long history in the fitness industry and that sort of thing. It seemed like it made sense for me to go into health coaching, but I was so triggered by so many of the topics that getting into, I'm like, ooh, I have a lot of my own work to do on my own sorts of things. And so I was just like, that's not a specialty that I want. And so certainly I've continued to do that work. And like you said, and the relationship between health and size was, for me, where I really had to do some work, because we have just been programmed that overweight is not healthy, whatever overweight is. And I was one too, that also being a muscular person, on the BMI chart, I was overweight. I was touching on obese at different times. And so I'm so glad that so many practitioners are tossing that metric away, because it's like,
yeah,
is that really a standard that is helpful in any way, shape, or form? And
no,
other conversation.
Yeah, and it's not.
Right.
And I think people don't necessarily realize that, like, the BMI chart is based off of data from the 1800s, and it only takes white European men into consideration. So unless you're a white man in the 1800s, it tells you nothing. It tells you nothing. And this is like the bigger problem with this is our medical system kind of honed in on that, because insurance companies were honing in on it, and it became this big tangled mess. And then we got this like, oh, now we're going to start calling like obesity epidemic is like a thing. And we're going to get all of this messaging that being obese is terrible. And yet the only diagnostic for obesity is this BMI chart. There's literally nothing else. They're only taking height and weight into consideration. They're not taking your genetics. They're not taking your fitness level. They're not taking any other health indicators into consideration. And then they're using the BMI chart. This is like a whole, getting super, conspiracy theory-ish. But now pharmaceutical companies are prescribing things, and they're doing surgical procedures and things based on BMI. And they maybe 15 years ago or so, they just randomly decided to lower the threshold for the cutoff for obesity and overweight. And guess what that allowed them to do? That allowed them to
more people
sell more drugs to people, because now there's more people that fit under the threshold for insurance to pay for prescriptions. It's our whole approach to health is it does not have the individual
So,
at heart.
yeah, so let's talk about your approach because we
Yeah.
could go on and on forever about all the things that are wrong. So,
Hmm.
um, let's start with intuitive eating. I
Yeah.
think most people have heard about it, but from your perspective, what does that mean? What are the goals?
Yeah. So intuitive eating was actually founded by two dietitians in the 90s. I'm so glad it's finally getting more attention now. It feels like it's been a while. But basically, what they saw is their traditional model of weight management was not working with their patients. They would have some success and come back. They would notice like they would do the yo-yoing. They would engage in more emotional and binge eating behaviors the more that they restricted. And so they created intuitive eating, which consists of 10 basic principles of how to, and this is like actually the deprogramming process, unlearning diet culture and the habits that you have accumulated over your life and getting back to how our bodies were designed to interact with food and movement. We're all born intuitive eaters, right? If you think about like kids, they know when they're hungry. They know when they're done. They know what they like. They know what they don't. I always I have a friend who her toddler son was having these mini corn dogs at lunch with us. And he was just picking off the breading part and just eating the hot dog part. And she's like, yeah, last week he did the opposite. And sometimes he eats the whole thing. Sometimes he just eats this and that. And it's because we know what our body needs, right? But then as we get older, we have our parents telling us you need to finish all the food that's on your plate. There's starving kids in Africa, right? And that tells us that we can't trust our fullness cues. We go to school and we have set meal times, right? So even if you're hungry in between, snack time and lunch, you're being told, no, you can't eat. And this is telling us we can't trust our hunger cues. And all of these little things add up over time and they build this level of distrust where we're now not knowing how to be in charge of ourselves. And some people are more susceptible to this than others. And we start looking outside of ourselves. We go to the diets, we go to this, I just want somebody to tell me what to do. What should I eat? I don't want to have to think about it. Just tell me, right? And intuitive eating is about getting back home to that, unlearning all of those behaviors and learning to increase your body attunement and your self-trust, because all the diet is doing is it's telling you what to eat, right? If it's keto that's saying don't eat carbs, or it's telling you when to eat, if it's intermittent fasting or something like that, or it's telling you how much to eat, if you're calorie counting or doing the plate method or portion controlling, whatever, right? Your body has ways of doing all those things for you. It has hunger cues to tell you when to eat. It has fullness cues to tell you when to stop eating. And it gives you feedback on what food makes you feel good and what food makes you feel terrible, right? Yeah. And so it's just about turning up that volume dial and rebuilding that trust in ourselves. So it's actually, I can quiet all of this diet noise. I don't have to get excited with the next fad thing that some celebrity is trying and be ooh, maybe this is the thing that will work, right? You just build so much trust in your body that it's no, I know what's best for me. I don't have to second guess it. I don't have to worry about it because I got me, right?
Yeah. I know when I was talking about this topic with a couple of my friends, and again, type A kinds of people and different fitness levels, but intuitive eating, I think, sounds scary or uncomfortable or unknown in so many ways because whatever system is in our head or programming, and we notice ourselves binge with certain kinds of food, and I sit down and I can eat the whole bag of microwave popcorn or the chips or however many Oreos, and so it sounds how in the world could I do this intuitive eating, because I would be gaining weight like crazy. So debunk that myth for me.
Yeah. So there is a component of intuitive eating that is what we call unconditional permission to eat whatever you want, whenever you want. And some people get that in their head and they're oh, I'm going to go crazy. I'm going to go hog wild, right? And that reaction of going hog wild and being out of control is a direct response to restriction. If you have been restricting and limiting yourself and living in fear of food, we all have this inner rebel, right? That is going to come out and go crazy. That is actually just part of the process. For some people, it's more extreme than others. But what happens is you do find a sense of normalcy. Like, have you ever gone on vacation and you're like, screw it, I'm going to eat all the things, have all the cocktails. I'm going to get dessert every night. Maybe you're on a cruise that has unlimited food, right?
Sure.
That's cool for a few days. Once the novelty wears off, you're like, ooh, I'm actually really craving a salad, right? Or I don't need that glass of wine tonight, right?
Yeah, feeling bloated and just
yeah, your body has that natural checks and balance system, right? And so yes, there may be a short period where you do kind of experience that swing into a little bit of binge behavior. And this is where if you're working with an intuitive eating counselor, it can be really helpful just to normalize it and explore what's happening mentally with that. But in the grand scheme of things, that's just a short-term reaction, right? And the goal is to eliminate those big swings, from one side of restriction over to binging, and find that happy medium where most of the time you're choosing foods that make you feel good. And if you happen to indulge in something, you don't feel guilt or shame about it, because that's not healthy either, right?
Sure.
Beating yourself up for it or living out of fear of something, that's not healthy either. So it's really about finding that balance for you. And it looks different for everybody, right? And that's one of the other problems with dieting, is that it takes this kind of one size fits all approach. Oh, if I lost weight doing this, you can too. But every single body is different. Nobody has your life. Nobody has your body. Nobody has your lived experiences. You have to find what works for you, and you're the only one that can do that.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So if somebody comes to you and they're starting out, wanting to learn the intuitive eating process, have no experience with it from before, whatever, what does the starting process look like? What are you guys talking about? What are some of the first goals and things that come into play?
It's so funny when people come in, they really want to start talking about nutrition and food right off the bat. And they're just it's that still stuck in that diet tent kind of mentality of just tell me what to do. And but we don't get to food for quite a while. We actually start with this belief unpacking and exploring your diet history. And what does that tell you? What is your history with your body? And what do you really want it to be? Right. And is your relationship with yourself where you want it to be, and what needs to change in order to get you there? We do a lot more just mindset work than anything. And we start to make sure we have a really solid foundation for debunking diet culture and that redefining of health before we really even start getting into the body attunement piece of okay, what does it really mean to listen to my body? What do I notice about my hunger and fullness cues? Start experimenting with what foods make me feel good and not, and getting into our emotional eating, coping skills. All of that stuff is actually a little bit further down the road than just this belief work, because it all does start in your brain.
Yes. And the listeners of this podcast will absolutely have heard that before, whether or not they believe it, but that's something I'm talking about all the time. And right, I think there's just so much to unpack with food that we've alluded to, because it's part of our culture. It's part of how we celebrate. There's how we were raised, and everything from your socioeconomic status and scarcity. There's just so much that is there. And like I said, that's what I started noticing when I was going through some of the health coaching portions. Wow, this is an absolute rabbit hole.
It is.
To unpack here, because I had never thought about it.
Yeah.
I had thought about different diets. Do I want to count calories? Do I want to count macros? Am I going to low carb, low fat, all of the stuff? And yet, and until I got into coaching, right, the part that blew my mind on everything, it's because I'm thinking it doesn't mean it's true. Another thing that I say all the time, and that is just so relevant in the context of this conversation, just
Yeah.
because you are thinking it. And even if you thought it, even if your mom thought it, like these are thoughts, and there might be something else that's true. There might be other things that serve you. It might not be true at all. So, really unpacking that. So I'm so glad to hear that that is a component, because I see so many people struggling with their weight in general. And
Yeah.
I think for anything to be sustainable, it has to come back to how you're thinking about it. Because if you
Yeah.
feel like this is a sacrifice, or that it's not going to work, and it's the self-sabotage, essentially, whether
Mhm.
you realize it or not.
Yeah. Well, and this is like where diet culture so fixates on behavior, right? It doesn't really do anything with mindset. It's literally the message is eat less, move more, and that's it. And if you can't make that work, there's something wrong with you. And so very often I get a lot of like emotional eaters and like binge eating kind of behavior, because we don't like this sense of feeling out of control. And it's like, I need to fix this emotional eating. And the answer is to like never have cookies or chips in the house, to, restrict more. And then that exacerbates the issue, because now when we do finally get our hands on some chips or cake or whatever, we go hog wild. And it's not about the food.
Right.
It really isn't about the food. And yet that's the answer we've been given, is that food is the problem. And that's why, one of the things I think that surprises people that come through my program is how much we spend on like the body image piece and the self-worth piece. They think it's just going to be intuitive eating. Like, give me the skills of like, of how to be an intuitive eater. But it's like, it goes hand in hand with how you think about yourself as a whole, where you put the value in yourself, how you think about yourself. And we've been taught that the answer is like, oh, I'll like myself more when I lose weight. If you don't like yourself now, you're not going to like yourself 20 pounds lighter either. So you have to start working on that first.
Yeah. And what kinds of things do you do with your clients to help them work on the mindset and changing up beliefs?
Yeah. So I am of the Brooke Castillo camp, and we do thought model work, right? And like practice believing new things. I really love doing values exercises where like you uncover what your personal values are. And I think a lot of people, that's a big aha for a lot of people, of like, once you're really clear on like the things that really matter to you and like the things you want to do in your life, they're not dependent on body size or your appearance. And if you can feel those values and embody those values, it makes it really easy to know like what's serving you and what isn't.
Yes, absolutely. That's early on in my coaching program as well, that the values-based approach. And for you listeners, Leah and I have some of the same training there with the life coach schools. So overlapping concepts of some of these things for changing beliefs too. But it can be a process. So for going back to our overachievers, our perfectionists, people who are hard on themselves, and dang it, we want this process to go faster. And it's not working the way it's supposed to be right now. And how do you support those ideas?
Yeah, it's really easy. She's like, how has that worked for you in the past? Because it hasn't, right?
No, it hasn't.
The quick fixes are the fastest thing to leave, right? And what I like to remind people of is that you have been living in diet culture. You have had weight-focused approach for literally decades. Most of my clientele is like, 40 plus. So you have decades of thinking this way and acting in this way and being this way. That's not going to change overnight. It's going to take time. It's going to take practice. This is a new skill that you are learning. So learning to have some self-compassion and patience for yourself is absolutely critical in this journey, for sure.
Well, I have so enjoyed and appreciated this conversation, Leah. If people want to learn more about you and your programs, where can they find information?
Yeah, so my main website is antidiethealthcoach.com. I also have a free Facebook group, antidiethealthclub.com, and I post daily in there just little tips. I have tons of trainings, and my favorite thing to do is I have a diet brain IQ assessment that I go through with people where you just take this online quiz and I come back and tell you how much of your behaviors and actions are being driven by diet culture and give you a few specific things to start working on to shift that. So you kind of know where to start, because that's kind of the hardest part is like, okay, I can recognize there's a problem, but I don't know what to do about it. So I highly suggest doing that if you're looking for like specific help in how can I move forward and start working on having a healthy and positive relationship with food in your body.
Mm-hmm. What a great resource. Thank you for sharing. As always, I will post relevant information and social media handles and things like that in the show notes so that you can follow along. Is the coaching with you, is that group coaching, individual coaching? What does that look like?
Yeah, it is actually a hybrid. So you'll get some one-on-one and some group. And the reason I designed it that way is because I think community is so important in this process, and being open and sharing and knowing you're not alone in this.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also can be really tough, and it's a vulnerable topic. And so that one-on-one space is like a really safe container to start working through your individual challenges. And it also, I have an online course for kind of all the nuts and bolts of intuitive eating that you can figure out on your own. Our time is best spent like unpacking the body image and mindset issues that kind of came with that.
Yes. For sure. So thank you again, Leah, and for my listeners for tuning in today. Go check out the resources and some of the information that she has. And I will be back next week with another episode of the Stop Overthinking podcast. Thank you for listening to the Stop Overthinking podcast with Kristen Odegaard. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with someone else who would benefit from the message. To learn more about working with me and links to social media and free resources, head over to my website, coachwithkristen.com. That's Kristen spelled Kristen. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss future episodes. Have a great week.